Hi, I want to talk to you about tentacles, robot tentacles. Wibbly wobbly mechanized tentacles. Randomly selected mesh objects dynamically spaced along a curve, then strung together with procedurally generated cables. It's a full geometry nodes rig with some pretty neat controls using Blender 4.0's new repeat zone and points to curve node. You want to watch me make it? Before we start, let's talk terminology, because naming things makes things easier, unless you're going to eat the things, and then it just makes you sad. These are our blocks. And these tubey things between them, these are our cables. And each set of block and cables we will call a unit, this one being an absolute unit. The blocks I've shaped out of cylinders. They all have a similar radius, but various heights. I'm far from a topology expert, so I'm not going to teach you how to model these. We'd both be embarrassed. But do feel free to leave a long comment telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong. That would be lovely. By the way, if you want this rig without having to listen to me prattle on, there's a link in the description to my Gumroad, which, I can assure you, is neither gummy nor a road. Anyway, for those of you still here, the blocks all live in a collection called tentacle bits, which sits over here waiting. Next, I'm going to add our curve, a Bezier curve. This curve is going to carry our geometry node modifier. Our first node is the repeat zone. Everything that happens in the repeat zone is repeated a number of times set by the number of iterations. The results of each are either passed to the next iteration, or on the last iteration, exit for the zone's output. Each of these iterations is going to create one unit for us. So the first thing we need to do is get our blocks into them. I'm going to set the iterations to 6. I'm disconnecting our Bezier curve, we'll get to that in a minute, and joining our tentacles collection into the zone. The 11 instances from the collection are joined into the geometry 6 times, with 66 exiting the zone. To add them one at a time, one per iteration, and randomly, I'm going to use a separate geometry node. I'm generating a random number to separate out a block by its index. I want a random range the same as the range of block indexes, so a min of 0 and a max of the number of instances in the collection minus 1. Yes, before you start yelling, this is 6 randomly chosen instances. We are generating random values, but each iteration is generating the same random value because they are all using the same ID. We can give each iteration a unique ID by sending an integer through the repeat zone, adding 1 to it every time. So, at the start of each iteration, the ID will be 1 more than it was before. And now, we have a different winner every time. It's gonna get real tight in this repeat zone, trust me. So I'm selecting our instance selection nodes and making them into a group. Don't get clever with your group names because that's a fast way to hate yourself. Let's add the seed to the group input because we're gonna need it later. Now, we're going to position the blocks on the curve. It would be good if we could see it, so I'm joining it in here at the end, before hoisting these noodles out of the way to make room for a set position node after our block selection group. Adding the curve to a sample curve node, which I'm setting to length. All 6 blocks sit at length 0, because they all have the same sample length, 0. To spread them, I'm going to use the same technique as I did for the ID. In fact, I'm duplicating the ID, renaming it ++ length, changing it to float, before passing it through the repeat zone and plugging it into the sample curve's length. Now, adding a value to the ++ length adds that amount on every iteration, so each iteration samples a position that amount further down the curve. Next, we're going to rotate our blocks with a rotate instances node. A kind person on Reddit recently informed me that I was mispronouncing Euler as Euler. I dedicate this align Euler to vector node to you, kind person. Even though the distance between the sample positions is the same, the fact that the blocks are all different sizes makes the space between them different. So we want to make these spaces the same, taking into account the different block sizes, like this. These spaces will become our cables. Later, we'll add dynamic control to their length. But let's not run at this like idiots just yet. I'm going to tackle this in two parts. Firstly, calculating the unit length, and secondly, lining the blocks up to the front of the units. To calculate the unit length, we need to calculate the block's length, using realize instances to turn the instance into geometry, adding a bounding box, and subtract its min from its max. This gives us the dimensions of each axis, the z value being the block's length. Having added this to our group output, I can now add it to our plus length, which now has both the block's length and the space which will be the cable's length added to it. Combined, this is the total unit length added to the plus length on every iteration. Back in block selection, I'm adding an input for plus length and an output for curve length. Given we are positioning the center of each block on the curve, the front half of it overlaps into the back end of the previous unit. But if we position it half its length further along, it'll line up properly and no longer invade the personal space of its neighbor. It's cable time. Still in block selection, I'm going to join points to the fronts and backs of our blocks, which will become our cables. To see these, I'm summoning the viewer. The viewer allows us to see any geometry attached to it. Wake, O mighty viewer. Show us the things you see. Right now, it sees the block from the first iteration. A viewer placed inside the repeat zone will only show us results from the first iteration. I'm going to use a mesh circle to make our points, so I'm joining it with the block. 8 vertices, and let's start with a radius of 1, checking this with the viewer. Then adding a mesh to points node to turn our mesh into points. Next, I want to position these at the top of the block. For this, I'm using our bounding box max. This positions them at the top, but at the top corner. We can center it with a vector math multiply node, multiplying the x and y by 0 so only the z remains. Now, if I reduce the mesh circle radius, I can fit them to the top of the block. To get the bottom done, I'm grouping these, renaming it cable points, duplicating it, then adding the bounding box min to the vector and joining it into the geometry. And thanks to the omnipotence of the viewer, we can see what we've made. Thank you, dear viewer, for showing us all the things. Sleep now. Sleep now, O wondrous node. I will never forget you. Everything is how we left it, though there is now an error in our rotate instances node. So I'm changing this to a transform geometry node because we're no longer just dealing with instances, we now have points. That exploded our blocks right off the curve, because now we need to rotate before we set position and offset instead as well. There we are. A quick bit of noodle tidying, then I'm going to head to the end of our node tree to make our cables. Using the separate components node, I'm separating our geometry out into 2 lanes, a lane for the instances and a lane for the points. In the points lane, one of these new points to curves nodes, and then a curve to mesh node with a curved circle for its profile. Points to curves has strung all the points together on the same curve. It's just like that straw you drank from at your dad's every other weekend. The points to curves node has a curve group ID input. It controls which points form a curve with each other. If they have the same number, they become points in the same curve. Back at the cable points group, I'm adding an input so we can feed the iterations ID into it. This will be used to make a cable ID, which will plug into the curve group ID. To give each cable a unique cable ID number, I'm going to multiply the ID by 100 and add the index to it. This means that for each iteration, each point in cable points has a unique number, but it's the same number in both the top group and the bottom group. Back at the end, I'm plugging our cable ID into the curve group ID. At first glance, this appears to have done nothing, but if we remove the instances, we can see that it has indeed made cables. It's just that it's made them inside the blocks between the points on each unit. Back to the front again, I'm going to add 1 to the ID of the bottom cable points group. This will give these bottom points the same cable IDs as the top points of the next unit. And now we have our basic cables. First, I'm going to add 2 empties to the scene and call them CTRL1 and CTRL2. This is a habit from the old days when vowels were only available in a paid add-on. Now I'm adding a second geometry nodes modifier to the curve, sliding it before the first. Dragging CTRL1 into the node editor so we can plug the control's location into a set position node, and immediately giving up because it doesn't work. This is because we've set the positions of both points on the curve, comparing the index and a number from the group input so we can select just the first. We'll change the group input number when it comes to the second control. That's position. How about rotation? Well, we'll reuse our compare result and plug it into a set handles position node. We want our handles positions to rotate around our control. To do this, we'll use a vector rotate node, which is quite the grown-up node, so prepare yourself. It takes a position, vector, and rotates it around a second position, center. I'm setting the rotation type to Euler before plugging the control's rotation into rotation, the control's location for the center, and for the vector, our handle's starting position, I'm using the control's position -5 on the X. And duplicating the setup but with +5 on the X, we can set the position of the right handle. Look at that, rotating vectors. But the best part is, if you multiply the control's X scale by either 5 or -5, you can use it to control the curve shape, pushing the handles further out or further in. I'm going to turn these 2 sets of nodes into 2 of the same group. Offset, vector, rotate. Who even were we before you came along? Our last control is our twist control. We all like a good twist, unless it isn't properly foreshadowed and then it's just lazy. We will be controlling the twist with the Y scale of our control. Using a separate XYZ node, I'm storing it as a named attribute called twist. Finally, I'm plugging our =A into the group input and also the object, renaming A control point and duplicating the modifier so I can also hook up CTRL2. Back in our original node tree, I'm going to foreshadow the fact we'll need the rotation of the unit later by storing it as an attribute. I was going to call it Chekhov's attribute, but I didn't because I don't like being beaten up. I called it rot because that's what she did to my heart. For the twist, I need to make space for the rotate Euler node. This will rotate our block and points. We just need the Z-axis for this, for the twisting and the twirling of the units. Now we can sample the twist attribute that we stored on the curve, and using a combine X, Y, and Z node, we can make it the Z of a vector that we can plug into the rotate Euler node. I want to randomize the rotation slightly for a bit of variation, so I'm adding a random value to the Z using ID for the ID, and now we can control the twist. The next thing I want to do is give the cables some shape. At the moment, our cables look like this. We want them to look like this, each end perpendicular to the block it's attached to. Remember the offset vector rotate node we made
2 minutes and 10 seconds
ago? I'm going to use this to position the curve handles. We want to position the right handle at the back of each block and the left handle at what will be the front of the next. So, moving once more to the back of our original node tree, I'm setting the spline type to Bezier, the resolution to 12, and adding a set handles position node. Look, I was lazy with offset vector rotate and I didn't relabel the inputs. But trust me when I tell you that input is the center of rotation, which will be the control point's position. Vector is our offset, which is how much we want to offset the handle from the center. And for the rotation, we'll use our rot attribute. Let's wheel again back to the block selector, because if we want to position the left handle at the back of the block and the right handle at the front, we need to know which is which. Setting a Boolean named attribute for the back points, then plugging it into the selection of our set handles position node. And that's the left handle of the back of the block. Making space to do this for the right handle positions. Using a Boolean math not node to get the front selection, then duplicating the other nodes, inverting the offset, and plugging it all in. I love cables with personality. For the cable sockets, a simple socket model called socket brought in with an object info node. On a second points lane, an instance on points node with the socket as the instance. We can make their rotation the same as the blocks with their rot attribute. Though those at the back need rotating 180 degrees because these sockets are outies, not innies. They all look like they've been screwed in perfectly now, which we know never happens. So let's add some random to the Z rotation, but not too much because we didn't buy this thing on Wish. There, that's the sockets done. Remembering how much I embarrassed myself not labeling the inputs of the offset vector rotate, I'm labeling the geometry nodes. roboTent control for the controls, and for the rig, roboTent rig version 1. Because that's what it is, the first version of our rig. We could stop right now and we'd be perfectly happy with roboTent rig version 1. It would totally satisfy our robot tentacle needs. But deep down, we would not be able to stop thinking how great it would be if the tentacle was always the same length as the curve. We'd stare out of the window, dreaming about squashing and stretching the cables, dynamically pushing the blocks increasingly more or increasingly less towards each end. And then, eventually, inevitably, we wake in the middle of the night realizing that all you'd need to do to achieve all of this is to calculate the total block length before you create the tentacle. This way, you'll know how much of it will be cables. So, to do this, I've duplicated the block selection group so I can build a new repeat zone around it. This repeat zone, or repeat zone the reboot, will allow us to randomly select the blocks, calculate their lengths ahead of time, and store them as named attributes along with their iteration ID, which we store on both the instances and the points as block ID. As with most reboots, there's much less to it than the original. Now we're sending all the units at once to the original repeat zone prepped. We can't plug this into our old block selection group. so I'm making a copy of the group calling it block separator. Spare no one, except the separate geometry node, which will connect to the group input to get just the instances. We'll compare the block ID to the OG repeat zones ID to separate the instances and the points out by unit, then join the selected geometry before connecting it to the group output. Now to get the block length, all we need to do is sample it from the selected instance, and as before, we create the curve length by adding half the block length to the ++ length. Deleting the seed input because we no longer need it, before going back outside and plugging the reboot repeat zones geometry into it. I'm making sure that both repeat zones have the same number of iterations, 4. And here we have exactly the same result as before, only now we can calculate how much of the curve each element is going to take up. A short, indulgent, improvised bout of node disco, preparing the space to add some things. To calculate the total of all our block lengths, I'm using the attribute statistic node. It does just as its name suggests. Having set it to instance, I'm adding our block length before reverently asking the viewer to return and show us the sum. In the spreadsheet, we can see that the sum of the block lengths of our 4 iterations is 9.185. Thank you, viewer. Get home safe. I'm plugging the curve from the group input into a curve length node, then subtracting the sum of the block lengths from it. This is our cable length, the total length of cables, and I'm threading it through our original repeat zone. I'm dividing this by 1 less than the number of iterations to get the unit's cable space, or cable unit length, because cables are only created between blocks, so there will always be 1 less. Now the cables will always stretch so that the tentacle fits the curve, because they'll always add up to the curve length minus the sum of the block lengths. If we synchronize the iterations in both repeat zones by connecting them to the group input, we can subtract the ID from this to get the number of iterations remaining. Then we can divide the cable length by it, having subtracted from the cable length the amount of cable used each time, dividing the amount of cable left by the number of iterations remaining, and we get exactly the same result as before. But, and this is a huge but, the tentacle will always fit the length of the curve even if we do funky different things to the cable length on each iteration. So if I use a map range node to create a multiplier from each ID to multiply each cable space either progressively more or progressively less than the last, the tentacle will still fit the curve. You see how the centers of the last and the first block aren't on the beginning and the ends of the curve. The problem is, if the center of the first and the last block are on the curve, then only half of the length of these blocks should be counted in the total block length. Using a switch, I'm going to multiply the first block and the last block by 5, selecting the first and the last blocks with a Boolean math OR node, comparing the block ID to 1 for the first and the number of iterations for the last. So now the cable length is calculated using a total block length, with only half of the first and the last in it. Because these block lengths are the ones we'll now want to add to the ++ length, I'm storing them on the instances as block length C. C for calculated, not complicated, don't be cheeky. I'm also changing the original block length of the first block to 0, so the center of it sits on the start of the curve. Now that we've done all of this, all we need to do is go back to the block separator where we sample block length C from the instance and plug it in to the block length output. I'm going to hook up the geometry node controls while asking you to please like and subscribe. Look, there's probably a better way of making robot tentacles. There's always a better way of doing anything. And there's definitely a better way of making robot tentacles. But this is the way I've discovered. It's a combination of techniques I've found while grasping in the dark, making other things. And I guess that's the point of this channel. If it has a point, that is. It's the things I didn't expect to make en route to the things I did. It's not the destination that's important, but the blends we made along the way.